Hello, and I'm at Carlton Hotel here in Singapore, and with me today I'm very pleased and very privileged to have Courtney all the way from United States to share with us the latest on crisis management. So thank you so much, Courtney, for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Right, yeah, so Courtney, when it comes to crisis management, I think a lot of our audience, right, they would have read about, some of the top cyber news like the colonial pipelines, NotPetya, right? And for, I think, a lot of the audience, there's no really distinction between what is a cyber incident versus a crisis moment, right? But I think for professionals like yourself who has a ton of experience in this area, there's an operational reality behind the distinction between an incident and a crisis, right?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. It's really important for organizations to have that defined ahead of those major incidents. There's usually some critical business operations internally or business functions that you need to be aware of, and when those start to become impacted is when you start to see the business shift from a traditional cyber incident response to a full-blown crisis response. And it could be things like I said, critical business operations or even health and human safety type factors.
So that moment when it becomes a crisis, right, is it something that is defined internally within the organization? How does the crisis management plan kick into gear?
Well, typically, once you've hit that trigger point, you start to involve major crisis management teams and leadership teams. And then depending on how you've defined it, you may also have to involve legal bodies and regulatory groups as well. So that's really when it's important to have that clear definition, because you don't necessarily want to involve those groups until you are supposed to or you have to. So having that information defined ahead of time is really critical.
So in those moments of crisis, right, I think there's a temptation for many of us, right, to batten down our hatches and retreat into like a lockdown mode, and that's probably a reason why many cybersecurity incidents get unreported, or when they eventually get disclosed, there's a significant delay. So in your experience, right, what needs to happen? What needs to be immediately prioritized when the crisis moment hits?
I think really trying to understand what the initial impacts are important, because that will really determine how you start to make external responses or statements. So I think a lot of times we initially retreat because we don't know what's going on. It takes a good 24, 48, or 72 hours just to figure out what's happening, what those threat actors might be doing, what the impacts might be, and if it's not a cyber-related incident, what the general incident is and how it's impacting the business. It also takes that amount of time to start to communicate with internal teams and figure out what your plan is. And so you see some organizations jump to making a statement in that time and say, right, something's happening, we don't know what it is. And sometimes that's a good way to respond. And then you have some, to your point, that just get very quiet until they know a little bit more. And I think that's a lot of what causes those delays in communication.
So there's a risk that companies or organizations can overpromise on what they can do to resolve the crisis, right?
Exactly,
in those 24 hours. I think when it comes to ransomware, there's a lot of talk that, the first thing that we need to do when an organization receives a ransomware note is to assess whether, a breach has indeed happened without, jumping into conclusions.
Right, exactly. And it's also important to understand who needs to be notified before you start to make statements, especially in ransomware. Cyber insurance typically needs to be your first call, followed by law enforcement. And if you miss those first two critical steps, everything you do after can be significantly impacted.
I think one kind of question that the audience will be keen to ask is also, when do you engage the lawyers? Because, you don't quite know what has happened, right?
Right, yeah, it's always a good question when to bring the lawyers in, or even whether it's internal lawyers or your kind of third-party legal teams. I think it's whether or not they need to review communications that go out from the organization. Even how you're monitoring or logging what's happening within that crisis response can be reviewed by legal as well. So I think understanding what the situation is and what the potential impacts are really should drive when legal gets involved, or if they should get involved at all. That should really be part of your playbook as well.
Right, okay. So you have a lot of experience, right, in this area, right? You've seen a lot of situations, you've seen a lot of scenarios. You worked with many different, I guess, types of personalities, emotions, right, that happen during those 24, 48 hours, right? And I think for our audience, a lot of the question would be, what are the kind of things that surprise you during those moments, right? Because we think that we have done a lot of rehearsals beforehand, right? We know what works and what don't work, but sometimes things always surprise us.
Right.
And, right, tell us
Well, I think it's interesting. I think sometimes we assume when people are in leadership positions that they are automatically going to be comfortable in crisis management or crisis response situations. And that's just not always the case. Some people, to your point, naturally lean into a crisis situation and they kind of embrace that type of adrenaline rush. And then you have people that get scared and they naturally fall back. And it could be regardless of whether or not they're the CEO or a security engineer. So that's helpful to learn during a tabletop exercise, but sometimes you don't really see that until real emotion comes out in an actual crisis situation. That's always a bit surprising. And then regardless of how many exercises or tabletops you run, you'll find that people still don't really understand or feel like they have the authority to make decisions, and so they'll still freeze in the event of an actual crisis.
Right. The other thing that I read about is also how, we assume that, for example, our email communication will still work during times of crisis, but obviously when it comes to ransomware, there's a risk, a very high risk that, we get locked out from the email. So then you have to depend on, I guess, your backup communication plans, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we find that communication tools and repositories for important information are the two most impacted areas when it comes to crisis management. So really just understanding who needs to be contacted and when is really important, and then how you're going to communicate with them. To your point, if you can't use email or you shouldn't use email because you can't ensure that it's secure, then what do? What is your backup form of communication, and where are you getting that contact information? That can really stall your response if you don't have that stuff ready.
Right, okay. And preparation, of course, is the key rehearsal, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
But there's only so much that we can prepare for, right? And there's a lot of assumptions that we build into, the preparation plans, right?
Yeah, and I think we need to move away from the thought that we need to do well in tabletop exercises. I think a really effective tabletop is one that you fail. One where you're starting to ask yourself questions like, well, what if plan A doesn't work? What's plan B? Or what's plan C? And really get the team to start to think outside the box, because in real life, you're most likely going to have to pivot and make snap decisions when you're not planning to.
Right. So I think one natural question would be, how often do you perform a tabletop exercise? I guess it's case by case, right?
It is, yeah. And unfortunately, we never have enough time or resources within the organization to do it as often as we should. I think when we think tabletop, we tend to think those one-day big group exercises with executives, and those are great, but very difficult to coordinate and can be really schedule intensive. So what if we moved away from that and started to do smaller, more frequent scenario exercising, whether it's quarterly or monthly with small groups? It allows you to exercise more scenarios that might be specific to the team, but also gives you a chance to get more people involved without having to shut the whole office down.
Right, okay. Talking about scenarios, right? There's only so many type of scenarios that we can brainstorm, right? With zero-day exploit vulnerabilities, and with AI now, right? There's an emergence of a new kind of AI adversarial attacks. So I think there's a risk that, we can't plan for the known unknowns or the unknowns, right? So what's your advice to, the organizations out there in terms of crisis management to plan for all these types of, I guess, very, very rare black swan scenarios?
No, you're absolutely right. It's almost impossible to plan for things that we just can't even imagine today. I think it's really important to remember that, regardless of what the actual scenario is, it's the impact to the business that we're looking to resolve. So whether the impact is caused by a ransomware attack or an AI attack, if it's an outage that we have to manage, it's probably going to be a lot of very similar decision points we have to make. The same if we're thinking about an integrity issue or a data breach or a loss of confidentiality. The same groups will most likely have to be involved. And if you're thinking outside of cyber, it would be the same for maybe a physical disaster or a natural disaster. So you almost hit the law of diminishing returns if you create a playbook for every single type of individual scenario and you lose focus of those bigger business impacts. I think, and the other piece too is really thinking about agile decision making. You're not going to be able to practice every scenario, to your point. I had an old boss who was ex-military, and he said, in the military, we practice everything because you have to be ready for anything. You have no idea what you're going to be up against, but if you practice lots of different things, there's a good chance you're more comfortable making a decision at the time of crisis.
Right, okay. I think in the cybersecurity sort of discussions, right, there's a new phrase now, right? It used to be, we don't know if we'll be hacked. But now it's like, you have to assume that you're hacked, right? And then you have to plan for the impacts, you have to plan for how you respond, how you recover from that. So crisis management, I guess, is in some ways quite similar to that.
Absolutely, yeah. You're right. For years, we spent a lot of time on the protect and detect side of the house, trying to stop the incidents from happening. And that's becoming increasingly difficult, right? It almost sometimes feels like you're one step ahead of the bad guys. But now knowing that there's always going to be some incidents that get through, what can we do to not only minimize those, but to your point, be prepared to respond quickly? Because statistics show us the faster you respond and recover, the more you reduce that impact to the business, the more you reduce the impact to consumers or your stakeholders. So it's important to get back on your feet as quickly as possible.
Well, speaking about that, right, I think a lot of us who are not in crisis management would be keen to ask, how do you define how well a crisis has been managed? How do you define that? Or how do you, what is the success?
Yeah, no,
looks
that's
like?
a really good question. I think ideally you want to come out of the crisis ahead of where you went in. So whether you've been able to build consumer or stakeholder trust with transparent communication, whether it's maintaining SLAs or communication with your business-to-business stakeholders, I think it's understanding who it is that was impacted by your situation and then really helping to make them feel comfortable and they trust that you're going to get back up on your feet and resolve the issue. I think stakeholders and consumers are fairly forgiving because unfortunately cyber attacks are quite common these days, but what they want to see is that you're reacting, you have a sense of urgency, you're taking it seriously, and you're really looking to rectify the situation as quickly as possible. And if you can hit on those, I think we've got some really good examples currently with Marks and Spencer and Qantas, where clear, transparent communication has really led to consumer trust coming out of those situations.
So if we come to you and say, Courtney, we have a business continuity plan, right? We have an incident response plan, right? Do we need a crisis management? It's kind of, there's a lot of overlaps, right? What would you say?
There is. To me, crisis management is the orchestration of those plans. So you're the conductor, and those BCP plans or incident response plans are almost the sheet music. And you as the conductor are going to make sure everybody has the right tooling, their instruments, and they have the right sheet music and everyone's playing the same song. And I think that's what crisis management is. It's really the orchestration of all of those plans, because otherwise you have people running around in circles hoping someone gets people moving in the forward direction.
So would you say that there's only one conductor then?
Typically, well, ideally there's one final conductor, right, where the decisions come to a point where someone has to make that final call. But oftentimes you'll have a crisis management team that helps to triage decisions, to bounce ideas off of each other and those types of things. But there's a lot of really tough decisions that end up coming to one person for that final call.
Is that normally the CEO or the...
It could be, yeah.
Right,
Unfortunately,
okay.
The CISO oftentimes falls back as well. I think people fall back on the cybersecurity team and the CISO because we're very good at fixing broken things. We tend to deal with a lot of crises. And because of that, even if it's not a cyber crisis, the CISO typically gets involved.
Right. And with your extensive experience, right, what is the one takeaway that you can, share with our audience?
I think the foundation and the basics, just like any other business, are what's so critical. So having critical contact information, critical playbooks and documents or response documents, and a clear way to communicate securely with the team really helps alleviate a lot of the stress and chaos. If you understand who you should be contacting and what the next steps are as far as a playbook goes, then it makes coordinating everyone that much easier and that much quicker for the group. And so it always comes back to the basics, being really good at the basics.
And of course, you should have the basics stored somewhere in paper format or analog format, just in case you can't access the digital format.
Yes, well, and there's a lot of we recommend an out-of-band digital solution at this point. So there are ways to actually move things and decouple them from your network, but still have kind of a digital solution to that. Paper is a great backup as well, as long as you can access it. If there's a physical crisis, a fire in the building, or some other type of natural disaster, you're most likely not going to be able to get to those paper documents.
Right, okay. Yeah, so Courtney, thank you so much for sharing with us really, really quickly on crisis management. And I think hopefully our audience will go away and think, we need a proper backup plans for all our crisis management plans, because there's a lot of assumptions that can perhaps fall apart during those moments of crisis. So thank you so much for your time today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.